Bob Bothwell, and I am a member of the Department of History at the University of Toronto, and from the International Relations Program at Trinity College. Our subject today is the future, and I'll get back to that in a minute and allow some time to pass. We have two speakers today. We have our friend Patrice Dutil, and I am told that he was introduced this morning. I would say about Patrice that he is one of the hardest working, most indefatigable, and probably most optimistic historians. Historians tend to be a rather gloomy lot, but Patrice, in the face of infinite discouragement from the historical profession, nevertheless upholds the banner of political and economic history, which is to say useful history compared to most of what is taught. Okay, and John McKay. And John is an affiliated researcher of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. And whenever I see the word complexity, I know that I'm lost thereafter. Complex social systems, I see those at work here. Use the tool of data analytics. Well, if that happens, I'll be totally confused. And I expect, therefore, that he is going to enlighten us and enlighten me in particular. So we're dealing with the future, and it is logical, therefore, that we start with the past. And my friend Patrice Dutil is going to talk about, as we can see, the age of the criminal Nixon, and he's appropriately framed with somebody, and then Lucky Pierre and Lucky Justin. So it'll be a comparison of all these things. This will be almost impossible, genetically peculiar. So Patrice, with the knowledge that I've written on the subject that you're going to speak on, proceed.
Thank you. So this is about the future, but it's not really about the future. This is a conference about the past, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the past and try to draw some comparisons with the present. I really don't want to, I didn't want to impose myself twice on this program, but Mark's call for papers was really wide-ranging, and I've written a book co-written a book on 1911, so I had to do that. And ever since Trump was elected and going on about the NAFTA, and then going on about the steel and aluminum imports, I've had Nixon shock in my brain, and then Mark Bonham's call for papers comes in. I said, well, I've got to write about this. So I want to draw a bit of a comparison, and as I was writing the paper, it occurred to me that we don't know very much about the Nixon shock. Some of you were old enough to remember it, to have experienced it, and it's worth looking at. Now, I ended my first presentation this morning by commenting on the boldness of Wilfrid Laurier. I'm going to tell you a story that's the contrary of that. It's not about boldness. It's something quite contrary. A game first. Let's start with a game. Who said this? Do you think that our friend in the State Department was serious when he made that little display, or was it simply a piece of bluff? We have too long acted as Uncle Sugar, and now we've got to be Uncle Sam. My basic approach is that the foreigners are out to screw us. Our job is to screw them first. And not least, trade wars are good and easy to win. Laurier about Elihu Root that I talked about this morning. Richard Nixon in 1971. Treasury Secretary John Connolly, and I'll talk about Connolly in a second. And Donald Trump, of course, in 2017. Let's talk about Canada and the Nixon shock. I'll talk about the shock in a second. But in my readings, in my research, I've come across a lot of works that have been done, and you can see from the list here that by and large, the historiography has been pretty positive, mostly because it's written by a bunch of liberals, but they tend to see that the Trudeau government in 1971 did very well. That it pulled its rabbit out of the hat, that it was effective, that it held its own, whatever that means. It held its own against the Nixon shock. So what I'm going to do is quickly, so the problem I'm looking at is how do we evaluate Canada's response to the Nixon shock? My argument is that, quite to the contrary, Canada was unprepared and made serious concessions. Are there lessons to be learned? I think there are lessons to be learned, and many of them came up with the second shock, the Trump shock of 2017, and then I'll come to some conclusions. The Nixon shock, 15th August 1971. It was a Sunday night. The day before, Richard Nixon's team requested airtime from the broadcasters in the United States. He came on TV that evening at 7 o'clock. The tape is available. It's on the internet, so if you want to watch it. And he made a series of dramatic announcements. There's a context to this. The American administration, the Nixon administration, was utterly convinced that their economy was in a free fall. Unemployment was climbing dramatically, almost 7%, which in the United States is a lot. It's regular here. The balance of payments was declining rapidly. Its gold holdings were depleting. The French government under Charles de Gaulle, from the early 60s until 1971, was buying gold, exchanging their American dollars and buying gold. Britain converted $1 billion worth of gold in May of 1971. A real concern, inflation's going up, unemployment's going up. Richard Nixon's in his third year. He's got a year for the next election. He's thinking he needs to get something done on the economy. Things are working very well in terms of foreign policy, in Nixonian terms, and he has to do better on the economic terms. He gathers a team together of impressive people. And on the 15th of August, as a result of a 3-day retreat at Camp David, he comes on air and he announces a new economic plan. The United States will suspend conversion of the American dollar for gold. It was pegged at $35 an ounce. The United States will no longer honor that commitment. A 10% surcharge on any goods that were already subject to surcharge. He's invoking the Trading with the Enemy Act. Does that sound familiar? 10% tax credit to any American company that is exporting. An elimination of excise taxes on automobiles. Income tax reductions for the middle class. Wage and price controls to control inflation as a result of getting off the gold standard. And not least, because you got to put that in, a 10% cut on expenditures in terms of foreign aid. So the context here is heavy. The people around Nixon are utterly convinced that they have to move on this, and the president goes forward. Pierre Trudeau had just left the country for his holiday in Yugoslavia. He has to come back real quick. Mitchell Sharp, the Minister of External Affairs, is holding down the fort as acting Prime Minister, and Trudeau has to come back. So Canada, of course, will immediately protest. It is not tied to the gold standard. It had a free-floating Canadian dollar since 1970. So on that front, Canada was not guilty. Protested strongly the surcharge and any preferential buying that was implied in the policy. The idea that Buy American came out in the Nixon policy, and the Trudeau government came out very much against that. This position, by the way, was shared by all of the countries trading with the United States. And the Trudeau government adopted a two-track policy development. First one was to respond to the American proposal, and the second one to launch a deeper think, which will, within months, by the end of September, generate the first paper on the third option. The third option being that you have to go beyond the dependency on the American market. Nothing new here. John A. Macdonald created a Department of External Trade precisely for that reason, but we're giving it a new presence, a new vibrancy. The Trudeau government is giving it this new sense of urgency. I mentioned John Connolly. Some of you may remember John Connolly, fondly or not. John Connolly, for those who don't, is a Texan. He was just named the Secretary to the Treasury. He didn't know a whole lot about the Treasury. He didn't know a whole lot about diplomacy. He knew nothing about Canada, nothing whatsoever. But he's in charge, and Nixon likes John Connolly a lot. He's a vibrant man, energetic, lots of ideas, lots of energy. Nixon, in fact, is thinking seriously of making Connolly his running mate for the 1972 election. Really strong presence inside the Nixon cabinet. Now, you notice that in the announcement President Nixon gave, the Auto Pact was not mentioned. It was actually in the papers, and it was pulled out quite literally on that Sunday morning. And it may be a game of bureaucratic subterfuge, but that announcement was pulled. It came back, however. The first meetings took place at the end of August. Deputy Minister Simon Ryerson was there. A couple of ministers, Jean-Luc Pépin was there. Edgar Benson, you may remember Edgar Benson, went to Washington and had their first meeting with John Connolly. It went really, really bad, really badly. 3 more meetings were scheduled, September, October, November. At the bureaucratic level, nothing was happening. Nothing was happening. How do you get out of a dispute like this? Canada got lucky. The world got lucky. And the solution came out of Henry Kissinger. The paper goes into considerable detail on all this, but Henry Kissinger was suddenly awakened to the reality. He was not involved. The national security, Henry Kissinger was the chief advisor to the president on national security advisor. The National Security Council had not been involved, had been deliberately shut out from the Camp David discussions. This was going to be an economic thing. Kissinger was busy with China, he was busy with Vietnam, he's busy with the Soviet Union, he's busy with India and Pakistan because they're at war, he's busy with a whole lot of things. He's put out. But the word got to him that all these problems being created by the Nixon economic plan were actually contaminating the relationship with those people that the United States depended on, namely NATO countries, in order to sustain its international policy, its foreign policy. And Kissinger, you can see that little head there in the middle, got involved. And this is the genius of Kissinger, to be able to get in under Nixon's skin, to wield himself inside the bureaucracy. And sure enough, Kissinger starts to be involved in all the meetings. Pierre Trudeau's chief foreign policy advisor, Ivan Head, finally contacts Kissinger, and within a week, a meeting is organized between Pierre Trudeau and Richard Nixon. What happened? Why was Kissinger mobilized? It could be that foreign heads of government got in touch. We don't know. It could be, and this is my favorite theory, is that the auto manufacturers got involved. Because what's happened, and I should have said this and I forgot, the Auto Pact starts to get involved. It was not mentioned, I'm sorry if I skipped over this, the Auto Pact was not mentioned in the Nixon announcement, but it was put in by Connolly and by the bureaucracy at the Treasury. So suddenly, Canada is negotiating for that sacred Auto Pact. It went completely contrary to the previous 6 years of partnership between Canada and the United States. So I come back to our meeting on December 6th, Monday afternoon, 4 o'clock, 2 meetings. In the Roosevelt Room, if you look at the map of the White House, there's the Roosevelt Room, and right across the hallway is the Oval Office. In the Roosevelt room, Jean-Luc Pépin, Edgar Benson, another confrontation with John Connolly. In the Oval Office, Pierre Trudeau and Richard Nixon. Here's what happened. Two fundamentally different meetings. Pépin and Benson literally offered to suspend, to end the auto pact. To end the auto pact. The first two conditions, Canada was willing to let go in return for dropping the 10% surcharge. The 10% surcharge did not apply to the auto pact, specifically did not apply to the auto pact. In fact, 80% of Canada's trade with the United States did not apply in that 10% surcharge. I don't get it, I'll be honest with you. But Benson and Pépin offered to abandon it in return for the 10%. Trudeau and Nixon, accompanied by Ivan Head and Henry Kissinger, had a completely different discussion. They talked about the Soviet Union. They talked about China. They talked about global peace. Oh, and they talked a little bit about trade. And what was said in those 2 hours? Basically, it came down to this. Pierre Trudeau said, "We are continentalists. We are continentalists." And he also said, "We are free traders." And Richard Nixon said, "Well, I'm a continentalist too, and I'm a free trader." We have no discussion. We have no disagreement. Two fundamental differences. There's a lot of great work being done by Ivan Head and Henry Kissinger to massage the president, to make sure he said the right things. Trudeau played it well in that sense. But his ministerial team gave up the shop. The blood was knee-deep in the other room. This is Ivan Head to Lawrence Martin. There's another note, though, that came out in the bureaucracy, from the bureaucracy. This is the National Security Council, a note in April of 1972. Had the United States ever made a firm proposal, the Canadians would have gone further than the point where conversations had terminated. In other words, Canada caved. Canada caved. Canada gave up an awful lot. So why is it we don't hear about the Nixon shock today? Because issues got resolved differently. A day after Nixon met with Trudeau, he took off, met with President Pompidou, the French president, Georges Pompidou, in the Azores. He got a deal with Georges Pompidou. A meeting was struck a deal was struck for a meeting in Washington on the 15th and 16th of December, 10 days after the meeting between Trudeau and Nixon. And the world came to an agreement with the Americans that the gold standard would be dropped. And Nixon was quite proud of that. And finally, on December 21st, the Nixon administration announced that the surcharge on imports would be abandoned. The auto pact was adjusted slightly, and there's a reason for that. It's because the auto industry told the Americans, and I presume they said it to the Canadians also, but there's no evidence of that. But Kissinger knew about it, and we have evidence of that. The auto industry said, you can let go of the two conditions. The reality is that we are structured now continentally, and you're not going to tell us that we're going to dismantle the millions, the hundreds of millions of dollars that we've invested in Canada to suit your dumb political purposes. Kissinger was of the same view. It is not worth the trouble to deal with Canada on such a petty, small issue. The auto pact was adjusted accordingly. It's a small adjustment. And Canada's exports to the United States skyrocketed in the following decade. I'm almost done. Which brings me to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, we all know, took a very negative attitude towards Canada. And the words that he used, for a historian, had a certain echo. And I looked into this a little bit more, and sure enough, I tortured myself with some Donald Trump literature, and sure enough, you discover that he had a great affinity for John Connolly. Same style, same bravado. He tore a page from the John Connolly School of Diplomatic Relations. I'm putting the timeline for your benefit. I'm not going to go through it. This is all recent experience. It's all lived experience. The president announced that he would be withdrawing. The Americans would be withdrawing from NAFTA. New negotiations would take place, and in the spring of this year, imposed a tariff on steel and aluminum coming out of Canada, again invoking national security, just like Nixon had done. Canada retaliated. It took a month. Canada retaliated. Canada had not retaliated in 1971, but Canada did retaliate this time. The only country that retaliated against the Americans in 1971 was mighty Denmark. The rest all had a united front, along with Canada, that they would not retaliate. Canada rejoined the talks at the end of August, and finally, of course, on October 1st, we have a new deal. So my presentation is brief, but there's a couple of things I want to bring out. Canada came out of the Nixon shock, that episode in 1971, despite itself. And there's a lesson here. Canada got out of it because the Americans changed their minds. Because the Americans had a dual objective. The real objective was getting off the gold standard. That was it. The rest of it was bluff. The rest of it was bluff. Once they got the gold standard, everything else was swept aside. There's a lesson here for us as historians, that substance and styles cut across the ages. There is a sense of déjà vu here. You see Trump, but Trump has predecessors, and it's remarkable how similar they can be. We were reminded of how impulsive the Americans can be when it comes to trade. Asia had a great impact in 1971. The whole thing was about Japan. Japan exporting massively to the United States with highly refined technology, cars that the Americans were buying like crazy. Now it's about China. So Asia looms large in our trade relations. The multilateral approach works. There's another lesson. I mean, Canada did work with its partners in NATO, in the OECD. It worked. But let's be blunt about it. Canada has no sustainable retaliatory power. The Trump episode, just like the Nixon episode, shows us that we are lucky to have a deal. We're lucky to have a deal. The Americans have all the instruments necessary to shut us down if they want to. We have to be prepared. And that joins other discussions of earlier today. Canada, of course, experimented with a variety of policy and industrial responses. The third option was launched, but it went absolutely nowhere. We've had trade policy reviews regularly. That's all fine. We have to be prepared. But what's more likely to work, just as it was with the auto sector, was that sectoral free trade is more likely to be the best solution. I'm going to finish up. I am finished. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions later.